Perfect. Well, good evening, everyone. It's an absolute great pleasure to have
Thank you for having me.
Samir Rizvi joining us tonight. As we discussed earlier, this is the first speaker event
Yeah.
in our Deshotel Capital Management student networking study trip. And it's also the first time that we've done a networking trip like this since before the pandemic. And also the first time that we're hosting an event like this outside of North America. So a lot of firsts. Really, really appreciative of you coming tonight. For a bit more background, the students that are in attendance tonight are most of our Masters of Management and Finance program, and also a handful of our Honors in Investment Management program as well. I'm constantly amazed by the amount of talent and drive and ability to pick up things on the fly that that students in the program illustrate. They share some of the common features that I remember of you when, just for some background to everyone, Samir and I first met when he was a McGill student as well. He was a student in the Economics and Finance program.
Correct.
Like 9-10 years ago?
So it was 2011 to 2014, class of 14.
Yeah, and I think maybe 2013 was when you took my applied.
Yeah, 12 or 13, I think. Somewhere, 13, 14. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's really been an exciting journey to see what Samir has accomplished in the short period of time since he graduated from McGill. He post McGill started his career in investment banking at Royal Bank of Scotland.
Yep.
And very quickly, if I recall, kind of earned his CFA designation, one of the youngest folks ever to achieve that designation. But what I remember most vividly, I guess a little over 7 years ago, is when you reached out to me and also and basically told me, Jir, I'm planning to leave RBS and start my own investment fund. And I remember my reaction at the time was like, oh my God, I love the entrepreneurial element, but it's difficult to raise capital in when you're that young.
Yeah.
But somehow you guys were able to get some amount of capital early on, starting with I think 3.5 million in assets under management.
Yeah, in dollars.
Yeah, in US dollars, exactly. And really the journey since then has been remarkable. As of this year, RDCP Group controls over $550 million of assets, so within a 7-year journey. And so we're going to be talking about that experience so far and some of your vision going forward, also characteristics of you as an entrepreneur. So probably the best way to start this is to let you describe some of the origins and motivations of RDCP Capital and eventually RDCP Group in your own words.
Sure. So that answer changes every year as I learn more. But originally, so I'd moved to the UK in 2014, joined an investment bank. And I don't know if any of you guys have worked in an investment bank yet or are about to pretty much, but it wasn't what I had imagined. So I had imagined, maybe because of TV shows and movies, I'd imagined it to be a lot more sexy than what it was. But basically for the first 7, 8, 9 years, you're on Excel, sometimes on PowerPoint, and that is the life. And you have to be my age now, basically, to start talking to clients and do some of the interesting deal making that was sold to me, I don't know, TV shows like Suits. That wasn't the only reason. What I also realized is your first maybe 20, 22 years of your life, you pick exactly what you want to study, right? Or what you want to do. Specific course, specific GCSE, A-level, IB. Once you get to a job, they tell you what to do, pretty much. So the first time ever, it was a shock. And not everyone in this room is going to be wired this way, but I'm not wired for people to tell me what to do. So I really wanted to do M&A advisory. I thought that's the thing to be doing in investment banking, but I was put on a debt capital markets desk, which is fine. In retrospect, it was useful knowledge because we use a lot of debt today, but it was extremely dry and boring. And we were doing mortgage-backed securities, really boring stuff. That's why we left. That's why I left. And Irina, by the way, so my business partner, subsequently wife, luckily, probably the best thing that came out of my 9 months at RBS was I met my wife, who is also my business partner. So we were a little bit crazy because we'd been dating for 8-9 months when we both quit. So I quit in, I think it was summer, I think it was May 2015. She quit June 2015. And yeah, we started up our own investment fund.
So tell us a little bit about how you guys even were able to launch the fund initially.
Yeah.
What some of the early vision was and how that kind of navigated over time early on.
So originally, we wanted to be a private equity fund manager. What that means is we wanted to work with third-party capital, limited partners, LP capital. That was the original plan. We raised a small amount from friends and family. And so we didn't quite succeed. Well, I was 22, Irina was 23. We weren't expecting to go raise 100 million. It would have been bonkers to, I mean, who gives that much capital to I mean, in retrospect, we were crazy, by the way. You have to be a little bit crazy to even attempt things like this. So we decided, you know what, we've raised about, and some of that was, I took all my dad's savings, which he was very kind to give to a 22-year-old kid. And Irina, my wife and business partner, she put all her inheritance money. So unfortunately, her father passed away when she was an undergrad, first-year undergrad. And so she had some like insurance payout and so on. And she put all of that. So that was our startup capital, plus maybe I think we raised $500,000 of like family friends. So yeah, that was $3.5 million, which is it's not insignificant, but it's not super significant. And that's how we started. But our plan always was, let's invest it successfully and then let's go raise fund 2. But that fund 2 never came because we figured it out that actually by reinvesting profits, by utilizing debt, which is not something many people talk about, people always, especially at McGill and in general, pop culture is very much around venture capital or go raise equity or go raise a fund. You forget the primary backbone of finance is banking, is debt. It's there for you to use. It's cheap. It was cheap. So that's what we did. So for a while, we still I think it was up until 2018, we called ourselves RD Capital Partners, and Capital Partners is a classic private equity style name. But in 2018, I think it was me and Irina decided, look, we're making phenomenal returns. Why don't we keep these returns to ourselves? So we bought out some of the original fund investors. They were on a fixed return anyway, so they didn't have equity. And we restructured it so it was just me and Irina, 50-50 shareholding. And off we went. We rebranded as RDCP Group, which is more of a holding company style setup and not a fund manager. We gave up our FCA license. FCA is Financial Conduct Authority, the UK finance regulator. Didn't need it anymore. Yeah, that was 2018, 2019. And subsequently, we've just, one after the other gotten into, now I think it's a total of 7 different sectors in the UK. We're sector agnostic. We tend to compete with mid-market private equity firms on things we buy. But it's a lot of fun because it's our own money. So from a wealth creation point of view, it's really interesting. From a let's not fuck this up point of view, it's even more interesting because it's your money. And also when we're buying these businesses, especially highly competitive scenarios where it's 3-4 private equity firms and us, the one thing I can say is, guys, the guy you're talking to who you just had the call with, it's not his money. He doesn't really care. He could go join another fund next month. Whilst we're going to be here, we're going to be that much more vested. And that's been our unique selling point, actually. And it's worked pretty well, and it's working well in the UK.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely interesting, and maybe we can kind of unpack a lot of some of what you've discussed so far, and maybe go back to kind of like the early stages. So you have that initial capital, but you guys, as you said, are a small organization at the beginning. So you had to, both from like a perspective of the investments you make, pick a niche, and also leverage your capital to be able to have a larger footprint in terms of the way you're raising capital. You talked about the use of debt, but maybe on the investment side, maybe talk a little bit about that initial focus and some of the core decisions that you made.
So we had to start in a sector where our lack of experience was still okay, because so bank debt is a lot like whether you're raising debt capital or equity capital, it is a similar sort of conversation. It's all about credibility, experience, track record. We didn't have pretty much any of that. We had a year of investment banking, which we were trying to extrapolate. Instead of saying investment banking analyst on our LinkedIn's, as you used to say investment banker. used to hide my McGill graduation year and so on, which I think I still hide my McGill. Gosh, I should get over that now. It's fine, class of 14. But we picked a sector which was asset heavy, so the banks were, a lender would be comfortable, should things go wrong, they could recover majority, if not all of the debt they were giving us, which was about 70% of the purchase price. So we picked the elderly care sector. So that's still, healthcare is still a core part of our portfolio. Not the biggest part anymore, but still an important backbone, I would say, of the portfolio. It's a business called RDCP Care. It's a portfolio of 6 care homes. That's where we started. And it was difficult at the beginning, but actually we picked the right sector because it was a sector that the banks loved. And because of RBS and some family friends, we sort of knew that this was a sector that didn't have too much private equity activity. Now there's significantly more, by the way. Every US REIT and private equity fund is all over the UK healthcare sector, consolidating the way they have in the US. But at the time, it didn't have quite as much consolidation, so it was a perfect sector for us to get started in. Subsequently, I've had family friends, significantly more experienced, by the way, 40, 45 years old, who've tried very similar journey, and there's just banks are now saying, sorry, no first-time buyers, no one new to the sector. Just all of a sudden, credit policies have changed. So we got lucky. So timing sometimes is everything, and luck does play a big part. But yeah, we picked a sector that we knew banks would like.
Yeah. I mean, in some sense, like the initial target market was asset-backed healthcare, but also like within that segment, really one that had stable recurring profits as well. And if you think about that choice at a broader level, right, it was kind of helping achieve kind of 2 things. One is it would, because of the asset-backed element of things, you'd be able to raise more debt financing so that you could lever the capital that you initially had. The recurring profits also provided you a source of more internal equity funding down the road, which also then would allow you to magnify
your... So just to add on that, if any of you guys get inspired to do something similar, which you can, you don't, by the way, the amount of capital we started with, in retrospect, you could have done half of that or a quarter of that. You don't need quite as much capital as we had raised. But I would say so that's forced us to pick sectors and businesses where profits and cash flow are the main driver of value, and not necessarily a lot of technology-heavy sectors where users and purely revenue are the drivers of valuation. So we've naturally picked, I would say, slightly old economy sectors: manufacturing, construction, engineering, business services, healthcare, some real estate. And that is what allowed our business to grow, because we could we ran them nicely, and we ran them lean in a relatively lean manner, and we've just reinvested those profits. So rather than leaving those profits to pay down debt quickly or further improve our lifestyle, we actually use that to continue buying great British businesses at really great prices. That's quite simply how we've been able to compound at triple-digit rates for 7 years.
And also, like, in terms of like where you've directed the investments beyond kind of the basic characteristics we've mentioned so far, I mean, another element of it has been private markets with an element of a contrarian nature in the investments. Maybe you can talk about the initial target market in that context as well, and I'm sure we're going to repeat the theme in other ways.
Yeah, so look, it's interesting you bring this up, and I recently heard a TED talk from from a lady who's done something similar to RDCP in the US. And what she was talking about, which is quite relevant for you guys here, because you're all in finance, and let's be honest, finance is about money flows, so you're all here to make money. So I can be honest with some of what I say. If this was a group of political science students, I'd have to be a bit more filtered in what I'm saying. But, so this lady was talking about this, and I'll just repeat what she said. But if you look at the Forbes billionaires list, which it's quite fun if you check it out, it's about 3,000 billionaires, right? So 3,000, which is a tiny group of people that control the majority of everything around us. 3,000 people, 3,000 billionaires. The single largest contributor is not technology to get them to that position. The single largest contributor is private equity ownership. So that's not necessarily setting up a private equity fund, but private ownership of companies. Why not public equities? Because there's significantly less arbitrage in public equities, because there's a lot more information. I'm sure you've learned in finance what is it called? The perfect market theory.
Efficient market theory.
Efficient market theory. There you go. There you go. Yeah. So it's not always true, but it does apply to a large extent. In private markets, it's almost like, did this particular business, if they picked, I don't know, BDO to sell them versus picking Rothschild to sell them, it's almost like listing on Luxembourg Stock Exchange or New York Stock Exchange and having two different valuations. And that is arbitrage. And that's how you build wealth. It's about, how can I buy $100 million for $30 million? That's the question you're asking yourself. And that's only possible in private markets. Real estate, for example, is another sector which gains a lot of popularity amongst folks who are trying to build wealth quickly. But real estate is the greatest contributor to making millionaires, single greatest contributor, because typically you know, as a family member, you buy something for $300K when you're 40, and by 60 it's worth $1 million. But it's the smallest contributor to the Forbes 3000 list. Again, for the same reason, where just like public markets, there's almost too much information. There's very little arbitrage opportunities. So yeah, I know I've gone a bit macro, but actually that's why we're operating in the private markets. You do get sometimes, especially right now, companies that are, I don't know if anyone in the UK, well, you guys are not in the UK, but I don't know if you've heard of a company called Made.com, M-A-D-E.com. It's like an IKEA. It's like a smaller IKEA. They listed for 800 million last year, June 2021, and their market cap is 20 million, 800 to 20 in 12 months. And now they're raising further capital, and their existing investors said no, so that it's going, they've hired PwC to sell them in the private market. So in a year, that's like the biggest disaster ever. That's a destruction of about £1 billion worth of value. But so those opportunities do exist in the public markets, but they exist significantly more in the private market. So I would highly recommend, from a wealth creation point of view, a focus towards private versus public.
Yeah, I mean, so in something to synthesize what you just said, I mean, private markets offer both kind of opportunities to generate alpha because of limited access to information, but also kind of less competition as well,
yes.
Although that
yes.
might ebb and flow over time, and
Correct.
It will depend on where you invest within the private equity space.
Correct.
But it's also kind of useful to kind of highlight also that joint decision of investing in private markets where information asymmetries are large, and also that decision of how to finance, and focusing in some sense on basic insights from the pecking order theory, where pecking order theory entirely built off of asymmetric information.
Yes.
And saying, look, the lowest cost forms of financing are what? Internal resources and debt. And so in some sense, the joint choice of how you finance and what you're investing in makes a lot of sense within this context. And that wasn't necessarily the vision right from the beginning, but you kind of navigated towards this.
Sometimes when you're forced to, we didn't successfully raise the equity capital we wanted to, so you're forced to use other resources, and then later on you realize actually that was a better resource to have begun with. But yeah, it's Finance 101, right? I think I remember this. I don't think it was your class, because you're too smart for that class, but I think there were other finance professors there was. But Finance 101, pecking order of your balance sheet is one of the most important concepts. How do you fund growth is so important. And that, by the way, is the differentiator of the company's wealth creation, you as the founder's wealth creation. Because if you use the wrong, and there's a McGill graduate example which I could use, which I shouldn't use, but I'm not going to mention the name or the company. But the guy has gone public. He owns 1% of the company. What is the point? He's earning less than the investment bankers that help take him public, and that just, to me, is wrong. So be very careful, because equity is not cheap. Equity is very expensive, and it comes with a lot of strings attached. Whilst debt, on the other hand, is like, you don't like it, you can refinance it. It's pretty much not, don't breach your covenants and so on. But beyond that, it's the opposite of a marriage, for example. Whilst equity is like marrying multiple people, and with all the downside, limited upside. So you're giving up a lot of giving away a lot of the upside is how I view equity. Whilst nobody actually tells you that, right? A lot of what pop culture, and probably what McGill is telling you is, well, technology is the coolest sector to be in at an investment bank, and being in a startup is a very cool thing to do, which I don't disagree with. But how are you funding that growth? Be contrarian to how you fund that growth, because most people just think there's only one way, which is let's go raise some venture capital money. There's much better ways and more profitable ways. Because then if you raise a bunch of venture capital money, you have to live the way they want you to. But you're in your 20s, you should be with a bunch of roommates and living a crappy life. No, if you've successfully built a business, you should reward yourself accordingly because life is too short. You can do that when you have the freedom of limited shareholders.
So you've talked a little bit about vision and being contrarian. Maybe you can talk a little bit about the early execution, right? Because those details matter a lot, and you had to learn a lot of that stuff on the fly. So maybe you can maybe even kind of describe like the first acquisition that you guys did within RDCP Care.
Sure.
And then talk about maybe how you develop strategies for deal sourcing, due diligence, and post-investment management.
Yeah. So the first acquisition, again, it's going back to 2015-16. We were trying to buy a care home. That very first one actually didn't play out. So the seller changed her mind. I think 3 months after the deal had kicked off, she changed her mind a day before completion, and that was, I think, me and Rena were like weeping. We lost $50K of deal fees, which I remember our lawyer at the time was like, make her sign I forget what it's called, but it's basically if she walks away, she has to cover your deal fees, sort of thing. And she didn't want to, and we're like, no, we don't want to mess around too much because it's a good multiple and so on. So yeah, people who know what they're doing, like good lawyers, listen to them because they're experts at what they do, and we chose to ignore his advice, and that cost us about $50K, which at the time was like a year's salary, which I'd stopped working at the bank, but that was like a year's salary, so that was extremely painful. But yeah, the first subsequent acquisition was a business called Kings Bromley Care Home. Brilliant business. We paid about 5 times EBITDA. And for that one, we got it right. The sellers were a corporate, so it was a bit more organized of a process. We had good lawyers, good advisors, which we're glad the people we picked, and we still work with them. Yeah, that was our first acquisition.
And when because you guys didn't have that background of operating experience within the sector. So maybe you can explain a little bit like the details of the transaction of how the investment kept operating and I guess improved also operations.
Yeah. So when you buy, if you do this, but when we did this, now we have a great structure where my time is probably 80% investments and 20% portfolio management. But at the time it was like all portfolio management. So I effectively became the CEO of what we called RDCP Care. So all of a sudden I was doing operational stuff, which is not what I necessarily wanted to be doing, but it was a great experience. So yeah, I think for 2 years I was CEO of RDCP, RD Capital Partners, making investment decisions, but also CEO of RDCP Care, and like ordering toiletries and things for the care home group. Like so things I didn't necessarily want to be doing, but it was a great experience because it taught you about all the way of how a business is organized, in particular that business, the various business functions and how to improve them. And to be honest, those few years were vital. Eventually, we promoted someone to become CEO, replace me, and that was, again, best decision ever. But those initial years where I was both an investor and a business person were really quite useful. And Warren Buffett said this famously once. He said, I'm a better investor because I'm a businessman, and I'm a better businessman because I'm an investor. And that is so true. In all the decisions we make now and all the various boards that we sit on of the portfolio companies, I think wearing both hats is really quite crucial. So it's almost like a businessman hat, entrepreneur hat, and investor hat that I constantly switch between, and I merge them occasionally. And I think that makes me better at deal making than some of the rest.
Would you say that the human capital aspect that you just discussed, where you were more hands-on kind of early on, but eventually found people to promote in order to kind of take the more hands-on operating role, like that strikes me as particularly crucial in terms of scaling, because even though you can grow your capital base over time, your human capital time base is fixed, right? There's no growing that.
Correct.
And so you see with like a lot of these models, like the RDCP model, you can think of it as being high growth entrepreneurship that's fueled by acquisition. And most of the successful companies, even though like details in terms of how they're funded and stuff like that differ from RDCP Group, one thing that tends to be common is that you have like the capital allocation decision in terms of like the financial capital is done by a small concentrated
Yes.
group.
Yes.
So like you and Arena.
Yes.
But when you look at the human capital kind of hands-on operating, it gets kind of delegated off.
So I've read this book maybe 3 times, and I just read it this summer. It's called The Outsiders by, I forget, do you know the author's
Will
name?
Thorndike.
Yes. So amazing book. He talks about 8 or 9 CEOs that have generated the greatest returns over like a 30, 40-year period, public company CEOs, and some of the best decisions. And he sort of summarizes takeaways from each of them. And one of them is decentralized operations, which is what we've done. So we now don't tend to get involved in any operations of any of the portfolio companies. Our approach is you hire very smart people and then leave them alone and let them get on with it. But centralized investment decisions. So all capital allocation decisions are me and Arena. We sometimes invite, if it's a certain sector, we invite that particular sector CEO in our group to come and sit on the investment committee for a particular acquisition. But ultimately, it's me and Arena. And that's been, that's what we enjoy, and actually that's been quite good for controlling all the capital flows within the group.
Yeah. I mean, one of the very interesting, by the way, highly recommend that folks read The Outsiders book. One of the things that's highlighted in the book is also the fact that you need to be very nimble in terms of how you do your capital. In fact, they call it capital reallocation because you need to constantly tweak with it.
Correct.
Maybe within that context, we can talk a little bit about how the capital allocation decision has been gradually changing over time within initially our RDCP Capital Partners and RDCP Care and growing and expanding beyond that kind of narrower niche.
Sure.
So maybe you can talk about like what motivated some of these shifts
away from healthcare and
exactly.
So for us, it was always we like the UK, and probably in a few minutes I'd like to sell the UK to you as to why it's better than Canada. I'm joking from an investment point of view. I kid, but we always wanted to be sector agnostic. We didn't. It's not exciting to me to be sitting here, and you probably wouldn't be here if I said I'm a healthcare company CEO. For me, it's way less interesting. So for us, we always wanted to be these swashbuckling investors picking and straddling different sectors, and it also worked well because, like I mentioned in the beginning, as we built up our portfolio, it was worth around £30 million by the time we decided to move into other sectors. That's also when there was a significantly increased activity by US REITs and US private equity funds. And when the Americans show up, it's like game over in any sector. So when they show up, asset prices rise. And that's what happened. So we started looking at other sectors. We branched into construction, eventually business services, manufacturing, engineering, and so on, and it's carried on. But that was the driver, is we want to find value in any sector. And at the moment, we limited to the UK, but eventually we want to look at Spain, other parts of Europe, and then the US, and probably Canada. That's the long-term vision. But for now, we want to get to $1 billion in the UK.
Yeah, I mean, in some sense, what you're saying is, we can kind of describe the overall strategy. We always talk about like buy low, sell high. That's the secret to generating alpha. But when I think about RDCP Group, given like the permanence of a lot of the investments that you're doing, permanent capital, I think of it more as like buy low and finance most and cheaply. But the question of buy low is going to be constantly changing, as you mentioned. In some sense, investing in your initial niche market, it became less and less contrarian in the early years of what you guys did. And you guys were looking then for the next contrarian subset of private equity. And as you guys expanded, I mean, I think about some of the investments that you guys made. There's like some aspects of it that are like systematic growth thesis, and then some were like opportunistic, where you weren't necessarily planning to build a portfolio in that saying. Maybe you can give an example of each. One example as you expanded.
So if I were to simplify what we do, and in a similar way to the way you just described it, Jiro, is we're generally doing a buy and build overall as RDCP Group, but then we do buy and builds in specific sectors. RDCP Care, our healthcare business, is a buy and build. RDCP infrastructure is our construction business, slash infrastructure business, where we're also doing a buy and build. And that's a very systematic decision that we took. And there's significant opportunity in the UK to buy at like, and this is what I'm telling you is literally what we're doing. We're buying at like 3 times, 4 times EBITDA. And immediately, as part of a larger group, it's trading at, so if we were to flip it, we could buy for 3 or 4 and sell it for 8, quite simply. Same with the care homes, we bought them for 5 or 6 and we could sell them for 10x, roughly. We don't want to, because we quite like we don't want to break the compounding machine of those profits being generated and reinvest into more companies. But that's really what we're doing. Sometimes, as Jiro, you asked, we do take an opportunistic view. So we acquired something called Chilango in August 2020 in the midst of the pandemic. Chilango is like a British version of Chipotle, except much smaller. So it was 14 sites. Well, I think it was 10 sites. We grew it to 14 sites. And that was totally left field for us, except we were getting it for £1 million, which was really quite cheap for a business that had about 10 million of debt in it. So it went into bankruptcy. They wiped out 10 million of debt and we got it for $1 million. Very tough business. I wouldn't recommend anyone, if you have great ideas of opening a coffee shop or something, don't do it. It's a very low margin sector. Unless you're a Chipotle or something, it's very hard to make any kind of margin in this sector. We eventually, and it was the only business we've exited, and it was more of a, I don't want to catch a falling knife as we go into this crazy inflation period. So we sold it in May 2022. So we only held it for under 2 years, and we sold it to a bigger Chilango called Tortilla in the UK. They have about 65 sites. Sold it for like 3x, so it's decent. It wasn't the return we wanted, but the world has gone a little bit mad with inflation, and UK seems to be leading it. So unfortunately, so we exited it, and smart decision to do it. But so we do hold. I'm not saying we have a set amount of capital set aside for acquisitions like this, but in a market like now, there's going to be significantly more companies on the operating table. So we're ready to, and they are landing, by the way, every single day. We're getting more and more of these really interesting businesses that are just either they borrowed floating rates and now the rates have gone up, so they can't service their debt, or energy costs have skyrocketed and they don't have sufficient cash flow to service their upcoming liabilities. There's a lot more of that, and it's really interesting actually. And you can make like 100x or 50x. So you can make textile returns in quite traditional businesses. And yeah, that's really quite fun.
You know, one interesting question to ask, especially as you guys have been expanding the universe of investments that you guys are willing to entertain, is what are some of the most effective strategies that you've found around deal sourcing, right? Deal sourcing, especially in private markets, particularly challenging.
Sure,
right?
Sure. So I think, all right, so I can talk about what we do today, but how we started. So if you're going to set up an RDCP of your own, call it condo capital, whatever you want to call it, it's as easy as that, right? But what we did, and I've had some friends, maybe I could name at least 10 McGillians who've subsequently tried to do it. Some are doing it reasonably okay, some tried and gave up. But they didn't do some of the basics that we did. And the basics were, right at the beginning, I mentioned one of them. We hit our graduation years. We extrapolated our investment banking experience from what it was to we made it sound like bigger than it actually was. We had a very good website right off the bat, so it wasn't like a Gmail. If you're trying to buy a business and you use a Gmail, it's an immediate, like, obviously, right? So we immediately set up a good business. So we put I don't know, it cost like £1,000 or maybe £500. So basic investment into the most basic things. I grew a beard that added a couple of years to my life, to how I actually looked. And all those small things allowed us to. We actually did what we don't do now. I avoid face-to-face meetings like the plague, honestly. By the time I was like meeting everyone, coffee, and taking people out. So we did a lot of that back then. Eventually, it catches up with you. So now, I don't know, we get like 50 deals per week, and it's coming from everywhere. And people try to take me to meet up for a coffee. Why? You know, what are you gonna? So I think after COVID, a lot of that has changed. So I think I kid you not, I've had 9 physical meetings this year. And so deal making has changed. So you don't need to actually physically meet unless I'm trying to close someone. If someone's trying to close me, I show me the value. What you say to me in person is not going to help. But for you guys, if you try to build this yourselves, I would recommend getting as professional as early as possible, so nobody can find any doubts in what you're trying to do. Because it's a very, if you're setting up a tech startup, it's kind of cool to show up in a hoodie and be that guy, because that is what pop culture tells you to be. But if you're setting up an investment management firm, it's a very gray hair, white man industry, arguably. So if you're trying to do it, you have to don't give them any excuses to say no, effectively, is what I would recommend.
Is there some, I mean, in some sense, this links nicely to in some sense, the purpose of students being here on this trip, which is kind of centered around networking.
Yeah.
Maybe there's some broader advice that you can give to students, maybe stepping away for a moment from RDCP group on best practices there.
Networking is tough, right? I remember those McGill events. They're always there's one investment banker guy, everyone's crowding around him. So networking is tough, and some of them, there's some folks who are like Jiro, who are like generally like mentoring young adults. Not everyone's like Jiro. Like a lot of these finance types are not as nice as you, right? So most of them are like, why should I give you my time? So a recent example that happened to me, smart guy, around my age, he was a common connection through a McGill guy. He kept asking me to take me out to lunch. I finally said yes, and he works at a private equity fund, but he wants to set up his own RDCP equivalent. So I gave him the secret sauce at this lunch, and I didn't expect him to pay me back in any way. But this is like, I can show you the WhatsApp message. Like, this is from a week ago. He manages his fund manages like 700 million, and they said no to a deal which he thinks is perfect for us, and he sent it to me, and I wouldn't have. And that's Rothschild selling the business, and I wouldn't. And that's if we do win that deal, I don't know, we're gonna make it's because of the market, it's selling for like 4 or 5 times, whilst it's really worth more like 8 times. So we'll double our money in principle because of this guy. So that's not, you can't offer that to every person you meet, obviously. but the principle here is see what you can offer to them also in return. For us, probably the most valuable thing for RDCP is deal flow. Nothing else. The single most important thing that I would say that puts food on the table is deal flow. So he recognized that at that lunch, and he repaid me. And now all of a sudden, I'm going to help him as much as I can, because that's a very useful relationship. But I would think about what value are you bringing to this person for them to help you. Because sometimes some people are genuinely kind, but not everyone's genuinely kind, you know?
I mean, and also an aspect of it is taking, in some sense, I mean, this one is paying dividends pretty quickly.
And I don't know if we'll actually do the deal, but the point is, sorry, Karen.
But taking kind of also a long view on a lot of these things as well.
Correct.
And having kind of this self-awareness of what you can potentially bring to the table that is different from others.
Absolutely.
Another thing that's kind of interesting is that core skill set around networking is also a core skill set around being an entrepreneur as well.
Yes.
Right? Because you know, some of the most successful versions of entrepreneurship, especially when you need to start small with a limited amount of resources, is exactly that, right? Knowing how to differentiate yourself from what exists in the marketplace, and having good strategies to get awareness around this.
I would say, obviously you guys are doing a fairly technical finance course. I would say a lot of what you're doing can be learned, right? But the soft skill that you pick up at McGill in particular, McGill is McGill BCom, and I guess the master's is particularly good at this, is presentation, articulation, and negotiation. If you can pick up those skills, they're significantly more valuable than technical accounting knowledge, which can be learned, right? And you can always Google it, because once you're on the job, you can Google these things. You can have your book right there, and others will be there to help you. And most of these big funds or big banks have models that they use anyway, so you just plug and play. So a lot of the technical knowledge is useful, but actually the soft skills are probably, as you rise the ranks at your own fund or at a bank or an investment fund, is the guys who can make it rain, so to speak, and that is all relationships, right? So the more you can, it's the same skill set that it takes to pick up a girl at a bar, or convince someone to sell to you, or convince a bank to give you money, or convince an equity investor to give you capital. It's the exact same skill set, right? So practice.
And speaking of practice, one of the things that we hope with Dizoted Capital Management is that experiential element of things gives you guys that opportunity to refine these skills that you wouldn't otherwise have an opportunity to practice in a normal classroom environment. maybe we can kind of shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit about 2022.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, how has your perspective on your strategy changed in this kind of, economic downturn and heightened uncertainty in the environment?
Sure. So you guys are graduating in a recession. That's going to be fun, right? So, and most of you probably know Jordan Peterson, and he's famously said, "Don't be nice, be a monster, and then learn to control it." And that couldn't be more true. I think the next 2 to 3 years are going to see such a shift in wealth. The rich are going to get richer, but there's a handful of people who are going to really make step-ups. And this is your time to shine. In fact, I would recommend, this is probably the best time to set up an RDCP, if you can. If you have a bit of, I don't know, capital from an uncle, or your dad has a bit of money and you can convince him, or whatever it is, or you have some, whatever it might be, or you raise a search fund. I know many people have raised search funds. This is the time to do it. In fact, this is probably the best time to do it. So yeah, I would say be ruthless these next few years, because the same banks that were hiring like crazy are going to be, Goldman Sachs is supposed to cut 50% of their global workforce. Credit Suisse is cutting Credit Suisse has other problems, but they're cutting about 20% of their workforce. So that's not a great time to be graduating, but sometimes, a lot of what's happened to me has been actually, this seems like the only option, and maybe sometimes that's a good thing. So right now is a great time to become an entrepreneur, especially an acquisition entrepreneur, which is what we do. Plus you have the technical knowledge. You're not going to learn much more technical knowledge on the floor of a bank. In fact, the more time you spend, if you spend all your 20s at like a private equity fund, you'll have to unlearn a lot of that to do what I do. So right now you have the basic technical knowledge and more through folks like Giro. I would say this is the time to set up your own vehicle. Also, you're going to build significantly more wealth, guys. One good transaction would be 3 years worth of any salary.
And so when kind of for instance, like the funding environment has changed within the course of the year.
Correct.
And I know you guys were initially kind of navigating how you would change some aspects of your strategy. Maybe you can describe a little bit of like how RDCP Group reacted really at the kind of onset of these changes, and also what you've been doing in terms of changing these details, but also kind of mitigating the impact and the challenges associated with the downturn.
So it's been relatively, so we started RDCP in 2015, which was like the bang middle of this business of this economic cycle, right? Literally in the middle from 2008 to now 2022. And so money was relatively easy. So although we had our challenges and we had the credibility issues and so on, it was relatively easy. In retrospect, it was quite okay. And I can say that now. But this year has been more challenging, significantly more questions, 3 times the amount of work to do the same transaction that we would have done last year with banks being like, here's the money. So a lot more effort, which is normal because credit tightens up when situations like this happen. And it was a correction that was overdue. So work has been more difficult, but I would say we want RDCP to be known as not an investment firm that only makes money in a good market, because most people can do that. We want to be known as a manager that can make money in any market, in particular a down market. So that's what we're trying to prove. And so far this year, we're doing well, and I think the portfolio is well protected to do well in what might be a down market or a flat market next few years. And it's not just what's happening to stock prices or general asset prices reducing. It's also wider economic variance like inflation, which is a killer on cost of raw materials, which then you have to pass on to your clients, which is quite difficult. And costs of borrowing going up is impacting our business model, and it's impacting every single, pretty much any investment model. So we're having to rewrite some of our closely held beliefs, but that's okay. So it is challenging. And you should contrast this with the chat I did with Giro a year ago, where I was a lot more upbeat. But it makes you more realistic. Yeah.
What has the role of the relationships you've built with banks played in helping you kind of dampen this impact? Because I know, like we've discussed this before, where you've also kind of, in addition to kind of a lending relationship with banks, you also developed further relationships in terms of like them even sending you
Transactions,
transactions, and that's beneficial to them because they get additional lending transactions from that. To what extent has being open to that type of relationship helped weather the current environment?
Sure. So look, you guys have probably been told this, building a strong personal brand is important. As you transition to business, building a strong business brand is very important. We don't work super hard on it, because if I had an Instagram where I was like overselling, that might hurt what I'm trying to do. But having a healthy mix is useful. So RDCP's brand in the marketplace is, we will never overpay. Some of you are super annoying about price. Like, that's the main driver. People sell the business, I'm like, this is a wonderful business, but the price has to be right. So that's our reputation, which is fine, which is good. And we have a reputation of, well, they're investing their own capital, so they really care. And that helps us stand out. And also, there's an accelerated transaction that's going on. I'm talking about generally. And they're accelerated, they call AMA, accelerated M&A transactions, when businesses are in trouble. And if you're a high red tape, high bureaucracy and private equity fund, they might not go to you because you might never get approved. But with us, when someone's talking to me, you're talking to the investment committee, 50% of the investment committee. So that's been our brand. And banks like us, because we've never lost any bank's money, thank God. So we have a 0% loss ratio. So in private equity, a loss ratio is, have you ever lost money on an investment? Or is the holding value less than purchase value? And we have a 0% loss ratio, which I'm very proud of. And the banks know this. And all of that combined gives us a good reputation as a good borrower, having a strong covenant. And that is going to help us continue doing deals in this market.
Given that we're in London, in the UK, maybe you can also comment a little bit about broader macro lessons that you've learned here that can maybe be helpful.
Sure. I'm going to sell UK guys.
North American markets and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So both opportunity within the UK, but also lessons to be drawn elsewhere.
Yeah. So because I'm a British citizen now, but I'm an outsider to the UK. I'm a first-generation immigrant. I only became British 2 years ago. So I have an outsider's lens, always on, and I don't think the country realizes what it's going through. It's really trying to find its place. So so if we zoom out, like really zoom out, probably a century ago, this country used to rule the world, right? This is what US is/was. Colonized India, colonized all sorts of parts of the world. But today, I think India crossed UK's GDP about a couple of months ago, or a month ago, for the first time in history. It keeps falling in rankings when it comes to countries with the largest GDP. London is still number 2 after New York when it comes to global financial flows, so that's something. So if you hear all these news, then it's leading the G10 when it comes to the worst inflation. We printed one of the most money during COVID, which was, again, very stupid. It was great for when we were trying to grow because we could get a bunch of cheap money. But in retrospect, it was very stupid. So that puts UK currently from a global, if you think about the major capital allocators, the Blackstones and the BlackRocks and the Citadels, UK is a contrarian bet. So this is not for everybody, because, we had, by the way, Kwasi Kwarteng, who was our Chancellor of the Exchequer, our finance minister. He currently there's a term been coined, Kwarteng, which is when you stay in a position for like a ridiculously short period. So we thought Donald Trump was a joke, and the current U.S. president doesn't, he has dementia and so on. But the UK is going through. It's a mess, right? UK is so from every angle it looks like a mess. But then if you really think about it, it's trying to find its place, and the British people don't realize it, but it's trying to find its place. Is it going to be an economic superpower? No. Do we want to become an Italy/Spain? Not necessarily. Are we going to lead Europe? We don't know. So I don't know the answer, by the way. There's no conclusion. I'm trying to work it out. And it'll take a few years to work it out. But what I do know is we're going super long. Because what all this means is assets are cheap, guys. And you have some of the smartest people, some of the best service industries, the best accountants, best lawyers, best banks here in the UK. And assets are cheap. So just to give you an example, the S&P 500 last 10 years has done this, about 3x'd. So, which is normal, 3x in 10 years or 2.5x in 10 years. It's quite normal. FTSE 100 has done this 10 years. That means for 10 years, the largest 100 British companies have created zero value for their shareholders. That is like unacceptable. If you think about it, it's totally unacceptable. But what that tells me is these companies are bloody undervalued. At like up and down the scale. So all the way from large caps to mid-market where we operate to small caps. So if I were you guys, and Canada has its own history, but it does have a similar market environment. So the US, I would say, is very hard to do what we do because unless you're a Blackstone or a Blackstone derivative, it's very hard to get deal flow. Canada is a little bit easier because there's below Onyx type big funds, there's not that much mid-market activity. So hence I know a few McGillians that are now setting up RDCPs in Canada. But I would highly recommend the UK if you want to find value. Perfectly good business. So businesses that we're buying for 3x, things never sell for 3x. In the US or Canada, or at least the US, things would only sell for 3x if it's like total distress, complete mess. Here it's just like asset prices are low. And it's not going to be this low for an extended period of time. It's like maybe a decade, 15 years-ish, I think. So from our point of view, just overweight UK.
Yeah. I mean, in some sense, he's highlighting, that there's opportunities for others to do
100%,
similar things
100%.
to
Banks are great here. Ease of doing business is, so my wife is Ukrainian. She's British now, but Ukrainian. So it was an Indian man and a Ukrainian girl, and we raised. We were on resident permits. Sorry, we were on both of us were on entrepreneur visa after we left RBS, and we got capital. People always thought that how could you raise debt? Debt is for business acquisitions. So from an ease of doing business point of view, UK is underrated, I would say.
I think it's you alluded to search funds a little bit earlier, right? It's useful to know what are the different strategies you can undertake to get some of the initial capital you need to kind of get the flywheel going with this kind of growth strategy. Maybe you can describe a little bit kind of what a search fund is.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
I don't know if you're aware of other strategies that people have used to get that initial capital.
So even when I was at McGill, there were two ex-RBC guys who did 2 years of investment banking and set up, I forget the name, MTL Capital. Do you know this name?
Yeah.
They set up,
what company did they eventually start?
What is that called? Food something.
Good Food.
Good Food, yes. Do you know Good Food? Yeah. Right. So these guys originally, so they gave me, they semi-gave me the idea for RDCP, but they set up MTL Capital. They couldn't find a suitable target for whatever reason, but the point is that's what they wanted to do, acquire a company and become its leadership, executive management, CEO. And that's kind of what I did at the very beginning. Mm-hmm. But then you can, look, entrepreneurship and then acquisition entrepreneurship is you can take it, you're writing your own story. It doesn't have to be set in any way. So we wanted to become a private equity fund, then we became a search fund, then we became like a diversified conglomerate, which is what we are today. It doesn't have to be, but a good place to start is search fund. So if you have to, because what happens is you might have great ideas, but to convince a bank or to sell a story, you have to at least pretend to be in a niche, which is what we did. We called ourselves a healthcare investment firm, even if that's not what your grand vision might be. But I highly recommend a search fund model.
Maybe just to clarify, for those who aren't familiar with what a search fund is, basically what a search fund is you have basically founders who, it's basically people who want to be entrepreneurs but don't want to start from ground zero. Instead, what they want to do is acquire companies to grow.
Think of it like a SPAC for kids.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
SPAC for 22-year-olds.
So basically what you're doing is you're raising capital to fund your search for an acquisition target.
Yeah.
And what you give in return to investors is the option to basically buy into your acquisition target at eventually a discount relative to what you'll allow other investors.
It has similar economics to like a normal private equity fund, so 2 in 20 or 1 in 10. So you're the fund manager, and similar economics depending on how much capital you put in. But yeah, it's a great way to start if you don't have capital. If you do have capital, honestly, beg your parents or whatever it is, just sell to them that you can do this.
But also, as you emphasize, right, the search itself is costly as well, so you need the resources for that.
Yeah.
Another example that I've seen is where someone like a Samir, to get the initial capital, what they do is they find. So let's say the goal is to roll up a bunch of similar small private companies into a larger organization. So one strategy that I've seen undertaken is, someone like Samir, who's kind of more the capital reallocation side of things, partners up with an entrepreneur who has that operator background, but also has access to capital because they've built equity in their company over an extended period of time. They partner and then start doing acquisitions that way. So that's another strategy that I've seen used for getting early capital.
So this a McGill graduate who I mentioned, he's the one who entered this other guy. So they did a transaction together because they're about 30, so they have a reasonable amount of savings from their career in private equity. They did a transaction together, but they don't want to necessarily be partners. But that one transaction gave them sufficient earnings and then equity value which they could refinance on to go do their own thing. So that's how they've done it. So they couldn't buy a single business alone, but they could buy a business together. So the point is there's really nobody should be telling you how to do it. If you want to do it, you can come up with ideas. But really that's the whole point of, but that's the difficult part, right? If you go down this route, especially you guys, you're smart kids, you're so used to a curriculum. Investment banking is a curriculum. The moment you do this, there's no curriculum, right? There's no business plan. You might have and the business plan, whatever it is, it might be in your head, is changing all the time. So if you go down this path, I would say get used to it's almost more art than science,
And one common theme, in some sense, through all of these different approaches to getting the initial capital that we mentioned, is that the provider of capital effectively, at the end of the day, is going to be oftentimes taking more of a bet in you than on the details of exactly what you're planning to do. I mean, even in some sense, the way you described the initial goals and how you decided, what your initial target niche was, right? You early on described it from a very first principles perspective, right? You're looking for an attractive price. That's why you're focusing on private markets where information asymmetries are large. You're trying to magnify your capital by making use of leverage in this context as well, where you can kind of keep your cost of capital lower through kind of pecking order type effects, right? But it wasn't immediately clear that you would exactly focus on the specific subset of the healthcare space that you ended up poking, right?
I might tell you certain things now, but 3 years from now, when we're doing another chat, the business might look very different, and I can mention it in hindsight. That's what we wanted to do, but it's more about having the right skill set and the right skill set is the wrong word, but the right mindset that actually I know what I'm doing, come what may, So it's about being equipped to take whatever opportunities might come your way, and in whichever sectors.
I mean, from an investor point of view, investing in you, for instance, you can see how it kind of makes sense to take more of a bet in a person than the details of the project that's being undertaken, because there is uncertainty on to exactly how you're going to implement down the road. So what you want to do is you don't want to bet on a specific path right now. You want to bet on a person that you think will be able to discover the right path going forward.
But that's what, even raising any kind of fund, that's what it is. When you raise a fund, they're betting on you because if they're effectively putting money into a black box. There's going to be parameters, but generally you don't necessarily know what you're going to buy. Whether it's a search fund, a normal private equity fund, a venture capital fund, or a SPAC, you don't necessarily know what you're going to buy. So they're backing the entrepreneur, always. Whether it's a bank or an equity investor type, it's always about the individual, 100%.
And I would say it's particularly true for the kind of thing you've done, and also with startups, for instance, right? Environments where there is a lot of uncertainty on what the details of the execution are going to be. And I find it useful in these contexts to think about what are the right frameworks to think about, not in sizing up a project or a specific investment, but sizing up people, sizing up founders and stuff like that. Maybe you can give a bit of your perspective on what you think are some of the most important characteristics about you, about Irina as well, how you guys fit together as a team, to really have made you an attractive bet from the founder standpoint.
So if I think about it in hindsight now, I would say you have to be, and this is tough, right? Because you're taught to be, especially if you're a high GPA kid, right? You're taught to not be crazy, to not take too many risks, to get it right. whilst to do what we've done, you had to be a little bit crazy. You have to. It's almost like, I mean, Richard Branson is probably one of the best examples, where he would say yes before he even figured out what this project was going to be. And we've, although we're very organized, and if you look at our website and some of our marketing material and so on, it does present a clear story, and there's some first principles that we generally know about what we want to do, but there's not necessarily a super defined, and there definitely wasn't at the very beginning, plan for how to get to $1 billion or 10 billion or 100 billion. I know the principles that will get us there, and I would think that is sometimes not, especially in academic circles, is not given enough value. The principles, the soft skills, which are sometimes way more important than the technical skills. Because technical skills, like I said, can be learned, but the soft skills are probably what helped us get here. You need a certain level of IQ, but if you have a crazy high IQ, Buffett says sell some of those if you can, because sometimes when you know too much, and that's my point about if you spend too much time working at a private equity fund or one of the large mega funds, what it takes to actually do it at a mid-cap level by yourself, for yourself, is a very different skill set.
I mean, one statement that you've made in the past that I particularly like is this idea of like done is better than perfect.
Done is definitely better than perfect.
Right.
Yeah.
And I have to say, probably like, a lot of our aspect of the schooling system does a really bad job of kind of, pushing that away from people, where you actually think, you always have to kind of get everything ironed out coming in. And I think kind of one of the defining features of successful entrepreneurs is they're willing to come in before they've ironed out all the details, but they have confidence and a self-awareness to know that they will have to react in real time to get
correct.
Right. So it's kind of like you might be firm on broad vision, but you're always willing to revisit the details of how you'll execute, where you'll direct capital, and things like that. So it's kind of this balance of, as you said, kind of being a little bit crazy, where you're willing to kind of not have everything figured out, but also this kind of curiosity to constantly learn and a humility to be willing to admit that in some ways, on the details at least, you were wrong and kind of course correct. Can you think of any specific example that might illustrate that a little bit within the context of what like the RDCP journey?
Yeah. I would say the biggest course correction. So I would say two big course corrections. One I've talked about, which is going away from being a fund manager to becoming a conglomerate. But the recent big course correction has been as you start to build up. So as we start to build up this, so the portfolio is now about $500 million. Banks are saying to us, "Hey, Samir, why don't we?" So I don't know. We have like 50 different tranches of debt across this portfolio, right? Different lenders, small, big. And so we have lenders who are like, "We'll refinance everybody, get rid of everyone, and we'll give you like fresh capital or let's call it dry powder of $200 million, because the cash flow supports it." And it's very tempting to say yes, but actually, what's our strength at the moment? And this was a big course correction. We were exploring this because it is quite appealing, and we can take some of that money out. So from a lifestyle point of view, it's very appealing. But our strength at the moment is everything is ring fenced. So if one particular portfolio company dies, nothing happens to the group. The moment we take on this big single piece of debt, it offers a lot of upside, but the downside is, well, we could lose the entire portfolio. So the upside is big, but the downside is a total loss, 100% loss, especially going into this market. So that was a big course correction.
Yeah. So in some sense, that kind of strikes at the heart of, for instance, the Outsiders book and around reallocation is, there are periods where you need to be more aggressive. And for a lot of time, you guys were fairly aggressive. I mean, even though things were ring-fenced, still pretty aggressive in terms of the growth.
So actually, you talked about being firm about vision, but flexible about the execution. I would also say we're actually, it's funny, you're absolutely right. We're very firm about, or we're very risk on, right? I mean, we're trying to generate, this year we'll do about 50% return on investment, which I'm unhappy about, which is a crazy return on investment, right? On 400 million, we'll get to maybe 600 by the end of the year. We've been doing triple digit returns up until now. This is our first 50% year, so it's not great. It is great, but it's not great. So although we're extremely risk on, we're also very risk averse. So these points like we actually have ring fence structures. When money is thrown at us, we actually know when to say, we know exactly when to say no. When certain businesses look extremely attractive, we know exactly where the trigger point is of actually we no longer have a margin of safety with this particular acquisition. So, and I would describe me and Irina as a little bit crazy. Despite all that, I would still describe us as a little bit loco. But, so it's that, as you say, it's a contrast of, or it's a juxtaposition of two things which you wouldn't typically expect to go hand in hand.
Yeah, so firm, aggressive,
Yeah.
But also being
Yes.
flexible
Yes.
and willing to make changes.
So risk on, but risk averse. And that's called risk management, right? That's what these large financial institutions spend years trying to figure out, is risk management, where you want to make money, but you don't want to lose the capital base. So we feel like we figured it out. And it's quite simple principles, like keep assets separate from each other is a very simple principle. Borrow where you can, and when you're borrowing, limit it to the target. Try not to bring in your existing assets as collateral. Simple things. But those simple things can fuck you up, right? If you get it wrong and you say yes because it was a very attractive acquisition that would make FT front page, it can screw you up. So we've had to walk away from certain transactions because the lender was going to do it, but they wanted something more. Yeah.
Would you say that, in fact, we haven't talked about this before, so I'm curious about the answer. Would you say that, like, you and Irina, one of you are more kind of on that aggressive side, and one more, and is that kind of part of the secret sauce about balancing each other out in the business perspective?
Yeah, we can talk about me and Irina. That's interesting. So, so look, Irina is my wife. We have 2 kids. Amazing woman, amazing mother, terrific business person, and she's a killer, right? Like she is ruthless where required. And I think she's made me even hungrier. In fact, so as you can imagine, when I moved here, complete outsider to the UK, to London, on my own, there's no way I could have set up RDCP, but she gave me the confidence. So she did her bachelor's at KCL, then she did a master's in economics at UCL. So she's a year older than me, and that's where we met. But she gave me the confidence because she'd already been in the UK for circa 4 years. She's European. She spent 10 years in France, so she felt more comfortable with the market here. What was your question?
Oh, how you guys balance each other out as maybe as a founding team,
Yeah,
but also
yeah.
as a couple, I guess.
So from an investment decision-making point of view, I'm significantly more. So if it was up to me, we would have made some stupid ass investments, right? So if I was making a lot of those stupid tech investments, which would have lost capital, she is significantly more conservative. So we balance each other out. That's probably an oversimplification of how we are, but she is a lot more focused on the downside, which is perfect because I tend to not look at the downside quite as much. She's gotten us out of trouble a number of times. Yeah, and it's sort of I wouldn't say there's a work-life balance. We just have a amazing. Like we go for a dog walk where we make investment decisions, like every day around lunchtime, we take a break, go for a dog walk. And that's core, Irina, this deal. That's when we make an investment instead of sitting around a table. So we've really, and COVID obviously changed a lot of things, right? COVID made the entire country significantly more comfortable, and entire globe, working from home, working from God knows where, and only doing a few days in the office. And that's the case for everyone in the UK I'm currently finding. So we found a really good balance of spending time with the kids, not letting anything happen to the business in terms of growth. She didn't have to take any maternity leave, which is amazing. Like she didn't take a single day of maternity leave because we were working from home. So she would be less present on some calls, but she was not involved in the business whatsoever. So she's a terrific partner. I can do half the things she does. I mean,
I mean, in some sense, what you're describing about Irina is highlighting both the importance of picking a business partner and picking a life partner.
I told him I would tell you guys this. Guys, your biggest career decision is not your first job, not what you studied or your major. It's who you marry. My God, it's the most important career decision. It can change your wealth if you get it right. Don't underplay that, by the way. That is like this fund thing. If you want to raise a fund, well, marry someone right. So that I told you today, given the year we're having, generally, I don't mean us, but just the world, I'm just going to be honest with you guys and give you brutal truth. But like, married right, you know. Biggest career decision. And I don't mean just money, but if you marry someone who is too satisfied, they will make you too satisfied. And I can use my parents as an example. I love my parents. My mom is the most awesome mom. And so is my dad. But she's so chill. So for example, my dad's been like a senior finance person in various insurance companies. I remember 10, maybe 15 years ago, the CEO was fired at the insurance company he was in. And I'm like, Dad, fucking apply for the position. Tell them you want. He was CFO at the time. And Mom's like, but you know, we're comfortable. It's fine. And that is a small thing. And it applies the other way too, by the way. If you have an unsupportive husband for the wife, it can be the exact same thing. So who you marry is actually, and you're all in your 20s and 30s, or mostly in your 20s, I think. This is, yeah, really think about it. So for us, I mean, I'm lucky I got it. We found each other and immediately we had let's get the hell out of RBS and go build some wealth.
A common drive and a common belief in each other.
A common agreement on kids, common agreement on, well, if we're doing this, we want to make sure we actually are doing businesses where we can still live well, because you don't want to live well at 60, you want to live well in your 20s and 30s. So that was and that was her push. She's like, Samir, I'm only going to do this if you're not going to invest everything and we live like shit. You know, so that was like a big push from her, that actually we're only young ones. And her dad, so a lot, like anybody, if you go to a psychologist, everything we do is based on our childhood and our parents, right? But in Irina's case, her father passed away relatively early, and he was doing pretty well in his engineering business, and he had grand plans to buy a yacht and so on, but he died at like 49 or something. So for her, she's like, let's not delay like living, let's live now. So work hard, but like, yeah, you can keep investing, but what are you gonna do with that pot of gold when you pass away? So it's like, let's live now. And we have kids, and let's give them good lives. And so that was a big push for her. And that forced us to focus on like cash flow generative businesses, high margin businesses, low leverage, well, buy businesses cheaper so you take on less leverage. And that's sort of, funnily enough, formed a lot of our investment principles today.
Maybe talk a little bit about the vision that you guys have going forward, more long-term with the company.
So our vision, right? So, and I'll be a little bit zoom out macro for this, because that is how our vision is. And I don't share this with everyone, but I'm sharing with you guys because you can handle it. So if you think about it, there's, back to the Forbes billionaires list, there's 3,000 billionaires that control everything in our lives. Of that 3,000, about 150 of them literally control all infrastructure and all money flows. Literally, 150 of them, roughly. Not politicians, just these 150 billionaires. And they literally decide everything from like, I mean, through social media and so on, things we think about or worry about, how we react to COVID, how each country acted. A lot of it is controlled by these decision makers through their money and influence. And everyone has a worldview. And the way me and Irina think about it is, if we want to have any impact of any type, we can do it with $500 million. It's great, right? $500 million gives us a brilliant lifestyle and gets us some nice deal flow, and we can do it with $1 billion. It's at 10 billion, according to us, that you start to maybe be somewhat relevant at 10 billion, perhaps. So to even have, so for us, the first order of business is, before anything else, first order of business, long-term vision, we need to get to, we need a seat at this table of this 150 people to be even able to think about impact. Because prior to that, and you know, McGill's a great university because it forces you to think. It's a very philosophical university. Some of the best conversations I've ever had in my life were at McGill. Maybe not totally sober, but the point is, it's isolated to that room. If you want to do something about it, you need capital. And there's a tech investor in Silicon Valley. His name is Shamit Palihapitiya. He's Canadian, Sri Lankan. He runs Social Capital, and he famously said, "With capital, you have a voice. Without capital, you're irrelevant. You can talk to your friends, you can complain to your parents. It doesn't matter. It stops right there. With capital, you can do something." Irina, who's Ukrainian, with capital, if we're managing 10 billion right now, and I can't believe I'm saying this on camera, we could hire 10 hitmen, pay them 2.5 million each if they get it right, and go kill Putin, right? But without capital, we can just complain, send some clothes. You know, so with capital, you become powerful. Without capital, a little bit useless. So what I would say is, go get the money. And it doesn't matter how you execute that, but go get the money, right? So everything else is a bit too micro, a little bit too details. I would say that's what we're trying to do, is get to the point where we can have real impact. We don't quite know what our worldview is, so we don't quite know whether that would mean trying to build a climate change focused, like trying to back a climate change focused company, or trying to solve cancer or something crazy like that. That would be part of our vision, but if we were trying to do that now, we wouldn't even be speaking, because we would have lost our capital and wouldn't be enough capital to chase this goal. So we haven't figured out our long-term worldview, but what we have figured out is, in order for it to be useful or be executable, we need to accumulate a machine that capital flows through. That's what we're trying to do. That's our vision.
I mean, it's another illustration of done is better than perfect. You know, like regardless
Yes.
of what your
Yes.
worldview or your personal choice of impact is going to be long term, you will need the capital in order to. So phase one, get the capital.
First
phase
order
two,
business, absolutely.
You know, phase two, figure out how you want to direct
Yes,
that capital
yes.
for impact.
And we'll learn that as we
and-
get older, but at the moment we don't quite know. But yeah, we will figure that out.
And one of the things that I find also kind of very impressive with how you approach things is how like effective you've been at drawing inspiration from different people, both on the investment front, but also like with your views around impact, philanthropy. So maybe you could give some examples of some of the folks that have had the biggest impact on your way of thinking.
Yeah, so many people ask me, because a lot of people are very mentorship focused. A lot of folks have mentors. I haven't had apart from you, Jiro, to be honest, I haven't had a physical mentor that I've spent time with other than Jiro. But for me, I think some of the best resources are out there. So I would say, and again, guys, you don't need to be super inventive. We're in finance. We don't have to be very inventive. Copy some of the best models that exist, and they're out there. So Buffett and Berkshire, probably the best investment model that exists. It's so simple. That's exactly what we're following. So we're trying to create our own Berkshire Hathaway.
By the way, I like to call Samir the Oracle of London, just for some background.
Thank you. That's very kind. So we're trying our best to apply his best principles. We don't agree with everything. I don't think if you buy a house when you're 30, you should still be living in it at 70. I don't agree with that. He's a bit hardcore. Irina would divorce me if we decided to live that way. But a lot of his principles are timeless. Mm-hmm. And I get asked, by the way, even today, like with Samir, he did this in 50s and 60s. Don't you need to be in crypto? No, don't do crypto. Please don't do crypto. Oh my God, crypto, oh God, we won't talk about it, but because the thing is, you have one brain, right? So if you're using that same brain to value an asset that generates income, and that's literally, income, and then it's going to keep generating income. Your net present value, that gives a value. Crypto or NFTs, these things have zero value, and it's being proven right now. But just don't do it, man. Because then what happens is it'll go up by 10%. You're like, fuck, man, yeah, that made sense. I know what I'm doing, and that will make you repeat that behavior, and that's terrible behavior. I would please don't do it. You might generate some return, but you're not doing anything. You might as well go to the casino and put it all on black or something, that's not investing, that's speculation. And it's fine if you wanted to speculate and you have a little bit of fun with it, that's fine, but that is not a long-term investment model, right? You can't, imagine telling yourself, I can do this for the next 50 years and generate alpha. How are you possibly going to generate alpha with NFTs, So it's, you have one brain. So use it wisely, yeah.
the lesson, avoid crypto like the play. And also, I would point out that you're not going short crypto.
No.
So part of it
true,
is,
true,
you know,
no.
you don't need to be right in every single bet you
Correct.
take, but you need to have that
Yes.
self-awareness of what you can,
Correct.
what you can kind of do very well, and where your kind of signal to noise ratio on insight will be will be higher.
But this is particularly harder for this generation. There's so much noise, right? For you guys, there's so much noise all the time. So to filter through that and have a system to use certain things and ignore others is difficult. So yeah, try to gain inspiration from the right things and the right people. That's probably a very useful lesson.
Yeah, and also like in terms of drawing inspiration, again, both from people in your direct network and people whose thought leadership you can kind of draw from things like books, you know, media and stuff like that. I think an important thing that I also really like about how Samir tries to learn from these examples is, you know, when he says he draws a lot of inspiration from, you know, Buffett and Charlie Munger, like the way you execute their ideas, it's not following everything about the script that they've done. It's you kind of abstract things away to kind of more, you know, first principle layer stuff, and then the details are going to change from era to era.
Correct.
You know, depending on your, you know, personal competencies and stuff like that. And so I think one benefit as well is you read pretty broadly, at least within the kind of the business space, and you try to kind of find what's like the big picture commonality between all these successful examples. So it's not, you know, I'm going to go and try to duplicate what others have done. You know, again, kind of more fundamentally, what are the core ideas, the key drivers? And what of those do you keep seeing over and over again, but where the details are subtly different?
Yeah, so actually just to add to that, besides Buffett, I would say for us, so if I were to describe RDCP Group and who we're trying to copy and base it on and gain inspiration from, obviously Warren Buffett and Berkshire Hathaway, Charlie Munger and Berkshire Hathaway, Shamit Palihapitiya and Social Capital, because Shamit also called himself Berkshire 2.0, and he's about 5 times our size, and he's about 10 years older, and he's doing it in a very different way. So he was the SPAC king, so he was leading the SPAC initiative, and go listen to one of his speeches, and he talks about go get the money. He gave a speech at Stanford, and his main message was like, guys, if you want to be relevant, go get the money. So Social Capital is very interesting because they have a lot more capital than us. I think they manage about 3 or 4 billion, but they're going after like curing cancer, curing diabetes. Like they're trying to do some long-term difficult shit. But if they get it right, man, those are gonna 1000x, right? So that's his investment model. So it's he follows some of Buffett's principles because Buffett would never do this, right? But then he's applying it in his own way. So we're trying to learn a bit from Berkshire, see what Social Capital are doing. Quite like Sam Zell. I think we talked about him last time. I quite like Sam Zell. He's built in quite a similar way to us, which is compounded his own capital to a certain extent. Those 3 are probably top of the list, I would say. Yeah.
And I mean, again, like in some sense, the Chamath example you give is a really good one, given what you said about crypto a second ago, which is
that's true. He likes crypto. Yeah, he thinks you should have some crypto in your portfolio.
So part of it is, you know, drawing inspiration from examples, but also knowing like, well, what do you draw from those examples, and what do you not draw from them?
Yeah.
And I think kind of in all 3 cases, Sam Zell. By the way, just some background on Sam Zell. So before becoming a professor at McGill, I was a professor at Northwestern, and Sam Zell actually funded my research while I was there.
That's really cool.
But yeah, like in all 3 cases, the details of what you have done have been very different. But again, at a big picture level, some of those first principles you mentioned at the onset of our chat today have been quite common across all these examples. Maybe what we can do now is we can actually open things up to student questions.
Please.
So if anyone has questions that you'd like to ask Samir, please go ahead. Yes, Hira.
Could you tell us some of the covenants that are placed on your
From the banks?
Yeah.
Wow, she's going really into I told you details are boring. Fine. Well, you got to make sure group EBITDA. Well, for individual companies, the typical covenants are debt to EBITDA. So EBITDA shouldn't fall below a certain level, otherwise you're going to breach the debt to EBITDA. Debt service coverage ratio, so the debt EBITDA should cover certain debt payments, and there's a ratio for that needs to not be breached. EBITDA negative variance ratio, revenue negative variance ratio, minimum cash covenant ratio. This is really boring. You really want to know this? but that's it. Those are typically the 5. So minimum cash in bank, drop in revenue, drop in EBITDA. Banks get nervous about this, understandably, so you got to manage it. All our portfolio companies are doing well. And this is actually the real test. So we've spent 7 years building up the portfolio ready for our first recession. We shall see how it goes, but so far so good. All board meetings are a bit more, we're having to think about things that we didn't have to think about in the past, but that is how it goes. But no, we're doing well.
Okay, so when you go to a bank for a loan, you tell them exactly which company you're going to be investing in with that.
Oh yeah. It's always target driven, absolutely. Yeah.
And my second question, so you mentioned that your company is sector agnostic. So the analysts at your company, do they specialize in a particular sector, or do they also work across sectors?
No. We're all sector agnostic. So we're very lean. So the investment team is just me and Irina. We have a CFO, and we have like a lawyer that's sometimes in-house legal, but sometimes external, and we have a corporate finance advisor who does all our debt capital raising. He's sometimes in-house, sometimes external, but we don't have analysts. So look, we make about maximum 8 investments per year. We don't need an analyst for that if you think about it. So for us, it's about, the way we think about it is, each acquisition should be meaningful. So it needs to be, we keep changing the number, but it needs to be like 5% of enterprise value of the current group. So if it's less than 5%, we will sometimes consider it if it's opportunistic or if it's a bolt-on, but it really needs to be around 5%. So at least each acquisition is growing the group by 5%, something along those levels. So because of that, each year we're doing larger acquisitions, so we don't really need someone to do a huge amount of modeling, if you get what I mean. So we have avoided, to give you an example, Berkshire Hathaway was like Buffett and Munger and their secretary for like up to like $1 billion. And $1 billion back then was worth a lot more today. And I think today they have like 30 people in the office and they manage about $500 billion. So you don't need that many analysts. I think, by the way, the private equity model is very stupid, but you don't actually need that many analysts. Something else to say, I'm going to talk about this in my annual letter for this year. There's a significant amount of what might be called Ponzi scheme works going on in the private equity sector. So currently, last 12 in 2021, 80% of private equity deals were to funds within the same organization or to other funds. So where they've transacted the same time.
Where they would crisscross the
KKR selling to Blackstone selling back to KKR. Now it doesn't look like Ponzi scheme, but they keep pushing the valuation. IRRs look nice, so you keep raising more capital. That model flips if in a market like this, so let's see what happens. But it's weird. 80% of sales are back to your own fund or to related business. Quite strange. But anyway, does that answer your other question? Yeah, cool.
Yeah, my question is with regards to your path in your education. So you mentioned you did investment banking. Jerome mentioned that you did your CFA early on. These are most likely 2 things that people are considering. Would you have done things differently? And so you mentioned search funds, building your company early, getting capital. That I understand, but would you still recommend going through these paths or starting after graduation?
Because the thing is, although I might be a contrarian and a non-traditionalist and so on, you operate in an environment where everybody else is a traditionalist and gives value to those things. So if I'm sitting across a Rothschild banker, this guy gives all value to the McGill finance and the CFA and the investment banking couple of years. So it's good to have it, because then it just skips those few steps. Whilst I've personally seen high school dropouts in the UK who've been inspired to set up their own RDCP, and they're struggling because immediately banks are like, dude, who are you? Your website doesn't make sense. You don't know what EBITDA means. Basic things. So actually, having a core, strong knowledge of finance helped us stand out very early on. I don't think if you do the first few years of banking wouldn't have added that much more. I think McGill Finance in particular, like, equips you particularly well. I kid you not. And then the CFA was like a bonus, because then it was a bonus and it was useful. Again, everyone can take their own path, but I would do those things again, yes. And definitely McGill Finance. Because actually, I apply a lot of those today still. From the pecking order to like all the core accounting concepts like are used every single day. You eventually drill them down to the few principles that you use on an ongoing basis, but I use them. And because they were drilled so early in my years, yeah, I think it gave me an edge, for sure. And I can sit across, and so the difference becomes, if I'm sitting across like an investment banker type, and you know the type, you have to put on a certain face. You got to highlight you change the tone a little bit. Versus if I'm sitting across some 60-year-old guy from Manchester who's selling his business in the engineering sector, I turn that off completely because he doesn't want to hear that. So if I start splitting out finance lingo, he's not going to sell me his business. So all of a sudden it's a husband-wife business. You know, we have kids, and we just want to take. So you change. You have to change it. So, but I think but having both, and this is kind of like the Jordan Peterson be a monster but be able to turn it off thing. So where required, because finance people are fucking fierce. You want to be able to switch it on, like I can outsmart you, guy. But at the same time, you don't need to share it with everybody because then it's overusing that skill set.
You mentioned that the asset price in UKs are very depressed in general.
Yeah.
And you believe that going forward in a decade it's not going to be the case. Why do you have this belief?
Well, I don't know how long before asset prices start to correct themselves, but I think good 3 to 5 years, we should be seeing like really reasonably priced businesses. Like the same business, it's quite simple. It's like we're buying this amazing engineering business, right? Literally completing in the next few days, and they do about just under 10 million pounds of EBITDA. In the US, that company would be selling for 100 million, 10x, quite normal, maybe a little bit more. Here, I'm not going to tell you the price, but it's cheap, like it is bloody cheap. It means you borrow less, it means you earn quicker, you deleverage quicker, there's significantly more free cash flow. It's a no-brainer. It's literally a no-brainer to creating returns. And then you create a conglomerate, and the average S&P 500 company is trading at 15 times. You create a large enough conglomerate or organization to be able to list on a New York Stock Exchange equivalent. You've made your arbitrage in a very simple, rather boring manner, actually. Can be done. So I recommend the UK. Canada, I don't quite know, to be honest, and some of my friends are now trying, so I'll maybe feedback through them and let you know. I don't know what valuations are like. Maybe you guys know better. For like, I would say 2 to 10 million EBITDA businesses. I don't know. But yeah.
One interesting thing to note with RDCP Group is, RDCP Group doesn't need to take as much of a strong perspective on the horizon of when prices are going to correct. So if they have enough conviction around the fundamentals, because they don't have outside investors who might pull capital away if things don't look good in the short run, they can take a much more long-term perspective, right? So there's less of this kind of market timing aspect with you guys than there would be with other
which for a lot of fund managers,
organizations.
if you get that wrong and you were supposed to have returned capital in 5 years, say that was next year, you can get it wrong and you're forced to sell, and that could mess up your returns. And you're right. No, we're lucky. We're actually very lucky. And to be honest, we chose that. We made that decision consciously because it's foolish to be forced to sell, right? Buffett would, think how stupid that is. So we're lucky that we don't have to be. We're not tied down to such rules.
I mean, it's interesting, right? Because some of the main early challenge. I remember the first time we discussed the vision around this stuff. The goal was to raise outside capital.
I know.
Sometimes the challenges and what might seem like a setback initially can actually create like a unique opportunity where you can have an edge relative to other players that might have had an easier path initially,
and
more long term.
And that's what makes a good entrepreneur, to be able to recognize that and pivot. And I sorry to use this. I know pivot is a very overused word, but to be able to actually roll with the punches, so to speak, but still execute that vision in a different way, perhaps in a better way. That is probably what makes a good entrepreneur and a good business person.
Without a doubt. Yes, Pane.
Hi. So it's kind of a follow-up to explained that here in the UK you were able to buy companies at really low multiples.
Yeah.
But then when you exit an investment, isn't that a problem? How do you manage? Are you able to sell it at a higher
Yeah,
multiple?
it's almost always linked to size. So let me explain size. Why size is and this is actually quite academic. You would like this. So size, right? So a business generating sub 5 million EBITDA, for example, sub 8 million EBITDA, is significantly more prone to a loss in profitability via a loss in a single customer, or loss in key management, or a loss in supply chain. The moment you get to 20 or 30, so slightly bigger, those problems are less relevant because you're a large enough organization. So if you 20, 30 million EBITDA business has maybe 5,000 employees, that you have a large enough board, that you have an executive management, not one key person who is a decision maker alone. Typically, you have a significantly more diversified customer base, so customer concentration is less of an issue. All those things mean your valuation is significantly higher, so you don't have that premium discount. So what I'm saying is, say a 30 million EBITDA business might be able to exit for 20x in the US. It'll still exit for like 15x here. So it is lower, it is cheaper, but it's okay. Whilst in the US, the companies we're buying today, we wouldn't be able to get for less than 6 or 7x, whilst we're buying it for 3x. But you can still exit for pretty reasonable multiples, but it has to come with size.
Okay, so in your strategy, you're really going to try to make the company grow?
Yeah, so we're doing buy and builds in individual sectors, and then we're doing a group, obviously, buy and build. Okay. So there's value attributed to each portfolio company, and then there's a group aggregate value as well.
Yeah. I mean, another reason why you have kind of a higher multiple at a larger size is, in some sense, you've got much more competition to buy, right? Think of like other large investment management organizations. They'll only invest in things of a certain size. So once you kind of cross over a certain threshold, and that threshold changes over time, that's when you really start having access to selling opportunities to much larger, more professionalized investment organizations that are going to be more willing to pay a higher premium for the assets. And
also because the required return on investment is lower.
I'm kind of curious, is one of the reasons for your bullish thesis around this model currently related to the fact that if you think about these professional investors that pay a higher multiple, like let's take an example, like there are crossover funds that invest, for instance, both in public markets and in private markets. With what's been happening in public markets, there's been some chatter around them moving out of private markets and back into public markets, right? Because if you look over the last 20 years, there's been a shift from public to private, and part of the reason was inflated valuations in public markets. As that starts to correct, capital gets pulled away from private market. And as capital gets pulled away from private market, maybe an argument can be made that less patient forms of kind of RDCP-like capital, now they're going to find it less attractive to do these type of roll-up strategies because it's going to be more difficult for them to exit, by rolling up and quickly exiting at the higher multiple because they have kind of a larger threshold to reach. But since you guys are less focused on quickly exiting, that means you'll have actually maybe less competition in terms of buying these targets.
Correct. Yeah. No. Very good point.
Go ahead.
I had a question in terms of more the psychological side of what being an entrepreneur is. Obviously, your case is a case of success, but throughout the process, I imagine you faced like a lot of challenges that might have made you think that it was all gone. Like, how do you actually overcome this situation from a psychological standpoint?
It's a great question. There were some dark times, to be honest. 2016 was a dark time because it took us more than 12 months to execute on our first transaction. And in the beginning, it's like your parents, like, dude, what are you doing? Your friends, you're still doing the same thing? So there's a lot of social pressures. And you took this girlfriend person that you met less than a year ago is here with you, looking at you like, what are we doing here? So so there were a lot of weird, dark moments. I would say, in retrospect today, motivation is overrated. Consistency is what it takes. So like today, this year, for example, deals are slower. everything takes much longer. Everyone's annoyed. Banks taking longer. The sell-side advisor like, dude, you used to close transactions in 2 months. This year it's taking you 6 months. So it is a difficult year. So this year, for example, I would say it's just consistency. So it's like, when the alarm goes off, as an example, you shouldn't be motivated to go to the gym. You just get up and go. Like, that's what it takes. So forget motivation, because some of the best entrepreneurs, they're not motivated. Like, that's not what it's about. To give you another example, the guy or girl, the person who goes to the gym, regardless of how they feel, will always beat the person who goes to the gym when they feel like it, right? So a year like this, deals are slower. We're doing the same. We're doing a lot of work, but staying in the same place. It has been that consistent sort of, all right, I'm going to get up, I'm going to do my morning routine, I'm going to chase the transaction, I'm going to look through live transactions that have landed in my inbox, I'm going to follow up on live deals, just on repeat. And it will work, but so yeah, I would say like having a good routine that allows you to succeed is probably what worked for us. And part of that is like simple life hacks, like I gym 5-6 times a week, which is very important for me. I dog walk, so I'm out like 3 hours a day. And that seems like a lot for giving nice sleep 8 hours and I'm still out 3 hours. When do I work? And I have kids. so I do 2 dog walks and I gym 1 hour a day. And those simple things, and part of it is one of the dog walks I'm doing a lot of like evening calls. So I do it at like 5 p.m. I'm calling things that I need to chase up on. And the first dog walk is when me and Irina do our investment committee things. Quite literally, I kid you not. So we make it productive, but actually having that routine, I know sounds really boring, but routine is so, I mean, like we have kids, right? You know this when your kids were young. If you don't have a kid, I don't know if anyone has kids here, I sound like an old man now, but if you don't have a kid a baby in a routine, it's chaos. They won't sleep properly, they'll get skin rashes, and it's a whole thing. So routine is the most important thing for a human, as boring as it may sound. And so that's what's helped us succeed, actually. We created a recipe for success, and it wasn't linked to motivation. It was linked to like, make yourself want to succeed.
Have you ever exited through an IPO?
No, not yet, no. No, our largest portfolio company is worth about £100 million. No, I think we should, I aim higher, because if you exit too early, or if you IPO on like a lesser exchange, that's like, not cool. So no, I would say we wouldn't exit on via IPO unless you're like $500 million, I would say, in the UK.
I mean, in some sense also like, like usually when you exit through an IPO, you haven't fully exited, right? So you basically sold off some of your ownership. And what you end up doing is kind of the opposite of what you guys have done in terms of like, more short-term capital as opposed to extremely long-term permanent capital.
There's benefits to exiting a particular business via IPO. Like it is a valuation multiplier typically, but not always. But no, I would say it has to be the right size. So we're not there yet.
And you invest only in the UK?
Yeah, at the moment. At the moment it's UK only. We would love to do the US at some point. And so back to my crazy vision around trying to get to this 150 most relevant people. I don't think it can happen being a UK only business. Although I think UK is very contrarian, you can make a fuck ton of money, but I don't think you can make that kind of money. For that you have to be in the US. You could do Asia. I'm Indian, but I think breaking into India now, unless you're well connected, it's going to be extremely difficult. Some of you guys look like you're from Asian backgrounds. A lot of money to be made in Asia. Not for me, but yeah, so for us it would be UK followed by certain European countries. Europe is also going through the same turmoil that I mentioned. So there's still like Spain and things, great markets. Spain is like the top 10 global GDPs. We'd probably look at Spain, but definitely the US and or Canada. But yeah, I think we want to get to $1 billion in the UK first before we branch out.
Do you have like a bit of a sense of what your horizon for entering the US might be? And are you kind of starting to prepare for, to the extent that you want, that we think of some of the patterns that you described with the UK as kind of happening with a lag in the US?
True,
Do you have a sense of that?
So we'd love to, I would say it would be bigger investments, a minimum 5 million EBITDA, first of all. valuation is tough in the US. That's the main problem in the US is things are expensive because there's so much capital. We might do Canada first. But US is also because we are long-term, again, because we're both business partners and life partners, our long-term personal vision is UK, Marbella and Spain, because it's like an amazing lifestyle, and Miami. So London, Miami, Marbella. So that also drives, it's funny how stupid things like this drive investment decision making, but it will. Florida also has a brilliant corporate tax code, much better than other US states. So yeah, that would be, so you can see we're chasing warmth and sunshine. So not Montreal, but yeah,
June is okay.
Yeah, June is all right. That's right. That's right. Yeah.
Alexa, you had a question?
Mentioned that you're like sector agnostic, and
Yeah.
you got one of your strengths that you kind of mentioned in the beginning is that you might be able to move more quickly because it's just you two kind of making the decisions here. And I was wondering, like, what resources do you use to like get smart on a space fast, or like get like you're obviously looking at the fundamentals of the company, but how much of like the industry or like macro stuff do you kind of look at?
So if it's a large transaction, like we did Intelling last year, which is one of you guys asked about IPO, so that's our largest portfolio company, Intelling. For that was a proper process led by a leading investment bank, and they'd done what is called like a commercial DD report, which I wouldn't have done it because it cost £100,000. Who pays £100,000 to learn about a sector? But they'd done it because it was like a part of the process. Like some of these people who spend this much money, like it's so much money. Why would you spend this much money before making an acquisition? But anyway, they did, so I took it because it was for free, 100K. So that's how we learn about that particular sector, which is business process outsourcing and business services. But
Specifically tech, it was the first.
It was our first
tech.
like quite techy, and it's a cool business, and it's scaling fast. But yeah, no, that's a cool one. But for other sectors, we work with banks who are quite good at that sectors, or I speak to like relationships that I have through my corporate finance advisors, or I talk to specifically our corporate finance advisor. By the way, like that is if I had to pick one person, and I'm not going to name him here, but he is the reason we have 10x or whatever x in the last few years. The right person in partnership and business can like completely change the landscape of your business. So he's a very smart guy, so I pick his brain a lot about sectors, and he's just generally very well known. So it's small things like this. It's not necessarily so a lot of the main reason private equity funds or any investment manager that manages third-party capital has to do this tick box exercises of like buying a very expensive commercial DD report or KPMG FDD report is because they need what is called reliance letters. So if things go wrong, you can sue the particular company that said, actually, this is how it's supposed to have forecasted. You can actually try and sue. Now, in our case, if things go wrong, we'll just deal with it. But when you're managing third-party money, you want to be able to point fingers, and that's what they do. But no, I wouldn't spend that much money on. You can Google stuff as well. Like honestly, the way you would write a thesis today is it's the same basic principles we use now, and also like instinct. I know I shouldn't be saying that because instinct means experience typically, but yeah, instinct, and then price, because if the price is right, then you have a significant margin of safety, and then you'll learn the rest once you own the asset anyway. So yeah, price is probably very, very important, more important than, in fact, the most important thing.
Kind of think around, rolling up within, new sectors.
Yeah.
Another thing to keep in mind is maybe you don't need to be correct 100% of the time, because in some sense, through a roll-up, your first bet is not like the total bet. It's you see how that works, and then you decide: do you continue to double down on something where your initial insights, your initial intuition was correct, versus kind of cut your loss? I mean, like for instance, I think like with real estate, right? You guys made some transactions, but you guys haven't been
real estate
doubling down there.
Real estate is so hard to make. I mean, if I use some general rules with real estate, if you look at corporate acquisitions, the typical amortization profile, like period of time it takes to pay back the loan is like 5 years, most of the time, 7 years sometimes. With real estate, it's like 30 years. And the reason is because it takes like 30 years of cash flow to pay back that debt. So why would you buy real estate? It can make you a few million if you get it right, but to do it at scale, the way Blackstone do it well because they're happy because their investors are like pension funds and insurance companies, so it's fine. They're pretty happy with the 6% return. But for us, we're trying to get like as close to a triple-digit return as possible, and real estate is just not feasible. Yeah.
I mean, maybe one way to think about it is there's an aspect to the initial decision that's kind of flipping a coin, and your goal with flipping the coin is to make it like heads I win big because I can continue to double down, and tails I limit my losses. Right? If you can get that kind of coin flip, you want to flip it as much as you can.
That's
right?
quite.
So there's an aspect of that.
And another way to think about it is if I get this bet wrong, I lose 1x of my money. If I get it right, I might make 10x or 5x or 100x. So it's these are relatively asymmetric returns that we try to target, and that's how we get comfortable.
Yeah. And
so we don't have to know everything.
Yeah. And the way you really benefit from this is by making sure there's built-in flexibility in what you do. And a roll-up strategy is one manifestation of creating a lot of flexibility in terms of the eventual scale that you're going to reach.
Yeah.
So, I saw a couple of other hands. Yes, go ahead.
I was just curious, earlier you said that you'd avoid the US because things are expensive there, multiples are high. But what did you see about competition here from American investors who are willing to be paying a bit higher than you? Just curious if you see that.
We see that on exits that are larger, but American investors, you're right, they have entered certain sectors. So for example, healthcare in the UK is being dominated by American firms at the moment. Other sectors we operate in, no, not so much. So it tends to be mid-market European funds at the moment. Now that might change if we speak again in 2 years, but at the moment it's mid-market British funds or European funds, and it's okay. We can handle them for now. But I mean, by the way, when I'm trying to sell and it's a hard sell, this happens a lot where it's a seller's decision. So it's certain markets or certain situations where sellers decide. I really talk shit about private equity in that moment because that's my only, because I can't give you more money. I can't. There's a few things I can say about us, but it's almost easier to talk shit about private equity, and it works. And I like, I'm like, gosh, you don't want to be one of their portfolio companies. They're going to treat you like shit and blah blah. So it works. It works. Whilst we tell them we're going to leave them alone, which we do most of the time. But no, I think we will see more competition from the Americans, and I don't know, we'll roll with the punches as usual, or we might go to Spain. We'll see. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, by seller's market, part of what you're saying is, a lot of these companies that you end up buying, that you're buying from the original entrepreneur who built the business, and being able to kind of credibly convey the story of, we're going to continue with something that's more than just a financial vision, but it's your baby, and so you want to kind of see it continue to be managed in a certain trajectory. It's not going to be short-termist of like, we're going to strip assets away, so completely change like these, the employees that continue to stay with the company that you've had.
So if I add some context to when I said we talk shit, we say things like, which is all true. With us, it's going to be. So I literally say things like, you owned it for 20 years, I'm going to own it for 20 years, which no other private equity fund can say. So that's a strong differentiator. Legacy, for most of the time, a lot of the time it's new sectors that we're entering or businesses where we don't plan to do a roll-up. So we can comfortably say, this is not going to be bolted onto something we already own. So your brand and your employees are taken care of. And finally, it's our money. We're going to take care of it. Those are strong differentiators, which tend to actually do the job.
Bing Cheng, did you have a question?
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to say I really admire kind of like your courage of starting entrepreneurship in acquisitions. And I think one of the most difficult process in this would probably say the screening process for investments. And you specifically mentioned that from kind of like the debt and also asset back, you kind of approached it from a top-down approach. And I was just wondering, when you're doing the rest of kind of like screening process, how do you do that? And maybe a follow-up question if you have time. How do you even
So I'll answer your second one first. It's what Jiro said. It's almost like heads I win, tails I don't lose much. So as long as that is applying, so we're not compromising, we're not offering too many of the other assets as collateral to get a deal done, or we're not trying to buy something so big that we have to do like a group facility or something crazy like that. That's when we're not losing much. So if that is being met, that's how we get comfortable. But beyond that, we're risk on. So we know how to manage risk, and some of the things I talked about ring fence structures and so on allow us to manage risk. But we are risk on. There's a long way to go, and the only way to get there is through acquisition. So we are very much risk on, especially right now, especially at good prices. Your first question about screening, the biggest filter is size. So I get things that are a bit too small, even for bolt-on. So that's a quick filter. Advisors don't like this, but I try to very quickly. They like to blah blah about how great the company is, and then I very quickly try to get to like, tell me the price, and it's offers invited, so I make a cheeky offer, and then they're like, dude, you're gonna offend them. So it's a bit of back and forth until it's a bit of like a very annoying, but just tell me the price. But that doesn't always happen. So so that becomes, I know I keep referring to price, but that is like, the reason I keep doing that is because it is what protects you. Because you overpay, you will always regret that decision, and you will breach covenants, and that's when problems occur. But if you've bought at a good value, at a reasonable discount or a deep discount to what you calculate as intrinsic value, that's where you make your money on the purchase. Most investors don't realize this. That's why they're so focused on exits. Like, you make your money on the purchase. So a big part of the screening process is price. Then it's like, does the management team work with us well? Will they work with us well? Are they independent from shareholders? Because if it's shareholders that are leaving, does a lot of the goodwill leave with them? And generally, is it in a sector that's going to be around for a while? So, but those become, well, the management team, price, and size are probably the three most important things, I would say, for filters.
All right, thank you.
Maybe we'll take one more question. Alexis, did you have?
I've already asked the question, so someone else.
We can do a couple, it's fine.
Okay.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, just linking to what Alexa asked about, and then what you said about Berkshire Hathaway. I mean, there were 2 and then 30, depending on how much asset they manage. When do you decide that 2 of you to manage X million dollars or $billion, hopefully one day for you, is like not enough, and do you have to scale up, recruit, and think maybe more broadly?
So we've talked about this. At the moment, both me and Irina sit on all boards. At the moment, both me and Irina are pretty much involved in every acquisition. When we're so busy that we have to split boards and split live deals, so I'm doing certain live deals, she's doing others, we're not even there yet. So at the moment, we don't even have to share resources within ourselves. So when we have to do that, and that's not enough, that's when we'll hire a third person. But that would have to be, it has to be a seasoned professional though. So it will have to be someone who can, someone like who knows, like an investment director. The role is typically called investment director. So someone who can like run a live deal, which is fun, and it's a bit of an organism. Every live transaction has emotions and all kinds of things, and hundreds of advisors. I would say probably, if I put a number on it, maybe after $1 billion or maybe after $2 billion, something like that, probably. Berkshire were honestly Buffett and Munger for a while. And then they did more strategic hires, like a CFO, which is more useful sometimes, and they can run some deals, but they can also do the accounts. So, we'll see.
I mean, in some sense, it sounds like you're saying, like, look, we don't know yet exactly when we're going to do it, but what you're doing is you're preparing yourself to be able to act quickly when you realize that the time is right.
Exactly.
So it's more about like what you're going to look for when you need it than when you're going to need it itself.
And it might manage itself because we continue to do larger deals each year. So it might still be a limited number of deals, just more meaningful deals. But yeah, we shall see. We shall see.
Any last question? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I had a question. Like you mentioned that you were interested maybe in expanding into Spain because of Marbella and all that. So being Spanish myself, and knowing that for me as a Spaniard, like entrepreneurship in Spain is contrarian.
Oh, really?
Because of the amount of bureaucratic drawbacks that you have in Spain. Like, taking that aside, what do you find attracting most?
I have heard through some private equity friends, these guys were actually smart and useful. Sorry. That actually valuations are good. In fact, they were telling me, I don't buy this. I'm like, how could it be cheaper than the UK? But apparently it's cheaper than the UK. So we'll go test it. We've had one conversation with the head of M&A at BDO. So they're selling like something in the commercial landscaping business. Sorry, in the commercial landscaping sector. So we'll see what they're up to. But but we're not doing entrepreneurship there, right? And neither are these businesses. These are old school businesses. So I wouldn't call them, these are like businesses owned by the same people for 20, 30 years. So I really don't know what the tech scene and things are like, but we wouldn't even bother trying out there. But you might be right about that angle. But when they see us coming here from the UK, they wouldn't view us the way I described to you. They'll think of us as like a seasoned investment firm from the UK. So they wouldn't put us in the same camp. But yeah, I've heard apparently there's numerous sectors that are ripe for consolidation, according to some private equity guys. But yeah, I do like Spain. Yeah, and again, I'm going to be generalizing, but apparently it is easier to do transactions in Spain as a foreigner than it is in France and Italy. And beyond France, Italy, and then Germany, it's just Spain seems to be the simplest. But you guys can see how simply I think, right? This is like basic first principles, simple thinking. Like it is not some complicated. I read something recently which said wealth is built via consistency, not complexity. So, yeah, keep it simple.
Panin, did you want to ask a question as well?
Yeah. So, for the past decade, you have built like tremendous wealth with your wife, and so I would like to know how your lifestyle changed. And
I love this question. I'm glad you asked. Come on, guys. This is the type of question you should be asking. You can't be asking about covenants. Like who cares about covenants? Great question. I'll be honest.
It's a serious question.
Yeah. No, I'm gonna answer it. I mean, look. We're all in finance, right? Like, let's be honest. We got into finance to be closer to money flows, to make money. So we're not doctors. We're not engineers.
But also, I read a lot that to build wealth, you have to keep you away from like buying
Stupid shit.
expensive stuff and useless stuff. So, what's like the balance?
Yeah. So I remember when we first started feeling the money, which was probably 2017. We'd go buy stupid shit. Like I bought like a Gucci sweatshirt, like such a stupid shit thing to buy. And subsequently, like I think this is ASOS or something, right? And this is like £10, right? So I've realized things I care about. For me, that is real estate, and I quite like cars. And I realize so we have kids. And I realize it's experiences. So having a really nice home here and having a really nice home in Marbella, which we haven't bought yet, that would be an experience to be shared by the entire family. It's also a good investment. So that's one thing. And it's about buying time. So our house right now has 2 nannies, 2 housekeepers, and a chef. That means me and Irina can spend time with the kids when we want, and we can work when we want. Everything else is taken care of. And that's where it starts to show up. So at the beginning, it's stupid things like sneakers or whatever, which I never did. But eventually, you start to buy back time, because the time is the only resource you can't really buy. But in this way, you can. So it also allows us to be able to think about more kids, because we're trying to get to 1 billion, then 10 billion. But if we want to make more kids, and Irina is very particular, like my career is not getting compromised because you want kids, and she wants kids too. Well, we can have 24/7, 365 nannies. It comes at a cost, but that buys us time. So that's why we're always happy with the kids. We're never annoyed at them, right? Because if we were with them 24/7, I wouldn't be here right now. She wouldn't let me go, and neither would, So we're lucky, and so yes, we're spending it in smart ways, but a lot of it is, believe it or not, around time. Yeah. Does that answer your question? You can ask more questions if what car do you own. Don't ask that question now.
Yeah, in some sense, these are consumption lifestyle choices, thinking of them as an investment as well.
Yeah.
But if you want to have some more colorful details,
Guys, if you want-
you
if
guys
you
can
want-
look at his Instagram
Yeah.
account.
Yeah, you can actually. Yeah. Oh god.
I think on that note, I mean, we've unpacked a lot
was fun, yeah.
today, both in terms of like investments, long-term vision,
Yeah.
you know, your partnership with Arena, lifestyle stuff. I mean, appreciate so much, you know, the time and insights you've shared with us.
My pleasure.
And also, you know, this event has been, as you guys know, recorded, so we'll have an opportunity to post this as well. So if there's stuff that wasn't clear kind of in the presentation today, you guys can review that later on. You shouldn't hesitate to get in touch with me in terms of clarifying questions you guys have. I can send them to you, or maybe they can link in.
Yeah. You can get my email from Jiro, or please reach out. Yeah.
Yeah. So definitely, you know, feel free to follow up on this.
Yeah, and in return, I expect deal flow.
Thank you so much, Samir.
No problem. Thank you, guys.